Hi, I'm Grant Aguirre and I'm one of the directors of the Challenger Sales Institute, and I am making this video for the competitors and judges of the ethics case competition. So your challenge in this case competition is to develop an ethics program for Paycom for their salespeople, since the salespeople are the lifeblood of a business and they are the ones that are interacting with outside constituencies the most. They have the opportunity to have the most negative impact on a business as a whole in terms of their ethical behavior. And so I wanted to take this time to make a brief video to talk about some challenges to ethics and developing codes of ethics and the valid ethical theories that you may use in developing your code of ethics. I've also provided you with a link on the website to a chapter in a textbook that I've written called entitled Managing in the Public Sector, a Casebook on Ethics and Leadership, that was printed by Pearson Publishing. I've given you the Word copy, the Word document, and that chapter goes into much more depth. I also have some other videos on YouTube that deal with ethics, so if you're interested in these topics or you want to do a more in-depth analysis for your presentation, I will provide links for more in-depth class discussions that I've had in the past over ethics, but this will just give you a brief overview. So, if I can get it to launch the program here. So, I usually begin this lecture with a question on what is justice and what does it have to do with marketing, and for this I'm going to tell you that justice is basically the question that Socrates begins with in a text called Republic. He goes around Athens asking people what is justice, and they're going to try and find the absolute concept of justice. And that discussion is really interesting, but suffice it to say that when we talk about justice in marketing, what we're talking about is ethics in marketing, and that's what Socrates meant by justice. So what is justice and what does it have to do with marketing? That's a question that you should ponder as you think about developing your ethics program for Paycom and for the sales force that they have. I give you a brief overview on why you should study philosophy and why it's important and these sorts of things in the slide here, but we'll just skip to the challenges to philosophical ethics. There are three big challenges. Ethics doesn't seem to be like mathematics in that there don't seem to be proofs in ethics the way we have proofs in mathematics, but I will tell you that most philosophers will argue that there are in fact proofs in ethics, and they involve logic and critical thinking. And if you're interested in that, I also have some videos on logic and critical thinking. But the three challenges and the ones that you need to avoid in your presentation are subjectivism, cultural relativism, and psychological egoism. Subjectivism is the belief that ethics are entirely up to the individual, that because there are such diverse opinions in the world regarding really critical issues like is it ever acceptable to cheat in business, is it ever acceptable to lie or bluff in business, that we can't come to any agreement. The problem with these challenges is that they all rely on three critical things that make them fundamentally flawed. So subjectivism is the belief that there are no ethics other than the individual's ideas about ethics. Cultural relativism believes that ethics reside in the organizational culture, and that can be problematic. And then psychological egoism, which says that human beings are determined to act in various ways, and that they can't really help but react in the ways that they do. And that's what we call a deterministic philosophy. So subjectivism, which is the first challenge to ethics and the one that you should avoid, and I will say this now and I'll probably say it again because redundancy is good. If you use any of these three in your presentation as a foundation for your ethics program, it will be an automatic disqualification to your advancing to the next round. So you cannot rely on these. You have to be aware of them so that you can answer questions if they arise by the judges, but you cannot rely on them as foundational principles. So subjectivism is the belief that all we can really know is our own selves, and that ethics is therefore entirely up to the individual. There are no concrete, hard realities in terms of ethics that we can know a priori. This is intuitively appealing because if we look at things like the manufacturing and marketing of certain types of drugs, they seem to be very, very difficult to deal with because lots of people have different ideas about them. So, for example, there are drug companies now that will no longer manufacture the drug combination that is used in death penalty cases, and they won't sell them to the states. Is that ethical? And if we look at these really tough cases, that would seem to be lend its support to subjectivism. But again, subjectivism is not valid because it's emotive in its foundational base. It doesn't rely on reason, and therefore we can't make it universally applicable. Cultural relativism says that ethics are based in the culture that we are either born into, or in organizational terms, the organization in which we operate. And certainly culture is important, but there are cultural practices and organizational norms that I would say violate even the standards by which most people judge companies to be ethical or unethical. For example, Philip Morris, which manufactures cigarettes, is often used as the classic example of a company that has a culture that was defined and described as ruthless, cold-blooded, and calculating, and saw nothing wrong with providing products that people don't need for sale. But most people, I think, would argue that that kind of thing is wrong. The law has recognized that in the tobacco lawsuits, ultimately, that were levied, and the charges that were levied against Philip Morris and the fines that they've had to pay. Finally, psychological egoism says that as a result of either nurture or nature, we can't help but react the way we do to certain stimuli, and therefore ethics is really impossible. The problem with this one is that it discounts that people have the ability to have free will. If you're interested in a full discussion on free will and whether or not we have it, again, I have some other videos on YouTube that you're welcome to look at, and I will provide links for those people who want to go in more depth. So what are the problems with the challenges? Again, they are emotive. They're not based on a rational analysis of alternatives, and they allow for what I call exceptionalism. They allow me to say that my group or my opinion is superior to others, and therefore we can't develop or determine universal codes or principles that we can all act upon. So the valid theories are the opposite of those. These are based on reason, they're not emotive, and they don't allow for exceptionalism. So based on these valid principles, we can develop codes of ethics that will be applied to all people in all places at all times and all salespeople in all contexts, at least in theory. So what are the valid theories? The three that I'm going to touch on, I touched on Republic already briefly, are teleological ethics, which is also called utilitarianism, deontological ethics, which is called rational absolutism in many instances, or duty ethics, and then virtue ethics. So the one that most business students like is utilitarianism, which is called the greatest happiness principle. And it's very analogous to Adam Smith's ideas of utility in the marketplace and capitalism, the idea that the free hand of the market will provide the efficient market hypothesis and create the greatest amount of economic utility. In ethical terms, what we're looking for is the maximization not of utility, but the maximization of happiness. There are two forms of utilitarianism. There's act utilitarianism and there's rule utilitarianism. The purest form is act utilitarianism, and act utilitarianism says that in every situation we have to analyze the totality of the circumstances. In other words, look at all of the players that are involved in the decisions that we're making, and then choose the best alternative that will maximize the overall greatest good for the greatest number of people. Notice that this is not the greatest number of good for my company or myself, but for all of the stakeholders, which would include in your consideration set the customers, the clients of Paycom, their distributors, the other employees of Paycom, the shareholders, and society at large. Rule utilitarianism attempts to develop rules that in the aggregate will produce the greatest amount of happiness. So for example, for a rule utilitarian, you might say we're going to have a rule that says that it's unethical to engage in lying in business, because ultimately if you engage in lying, you'll probably be found out, your company will go bankrupt, and that would be less than the ideal or optimum situation. So, problems with utilitarianism. All of the valid ethical theories do have problems, and you should be aware of those so that you can use them in arguing with the judges or the executives that you'll be presenting to. None of them are perfect, but again, they are better than the alternatives, which are the challenges to ethics. The problems with utilitarianism are that the means can be used to justify the ends, and this is particularly problematic with act utilitarianism. So, for example, if you cheat a certain small subset of customers, or if you give them higher prices, you can then maybe pass on the savings to other customers and allow for larger discounts, and that may be ethically problematic. Duty ethics, again, there are two types here. The one that I'm going to focus on is rational absolutism, which was developed by Immanuel Kant in 3 great works called The Critique of Pure Reason, The Critique of Practical Reason, and The Metaphysics of Morals. And Kant comes up with a formulation for ethics that's based not on what happens as a result of the actions that you take, but on the duty that is required of you in certain situations. So for Kant, results are unimportant. So if you engage in good business practices and you go out of business, that's not an important consideration for Kant. Rather, it's whether or not you fulfilled your duties. What are the duties for Kant? Well, one of the first duties for Kant is that you can never lie. You can absolutely never lie. This may be problematic in business, where bluffing is maybe acceptable, or obscuring the truth may be thought to be acceptable. Also in extreme situations where if you don't lie, it may harm somebody, or it may lead to bad results. But Kant would say you can never lie, because what you're doing in that instance is you are using another human being as a means to an end and not as an end in and of themselves. So he says you can never lie. You always have to treat every other individual, and this would mean our customers, our clients, our constituents, our distributors, our suppliers, and everybody in our supply chain, and society at large, with equal respect, and recognizing that they're autonomous individuals that need to be able to make their own decisions without being coerced or manipulated. So the problems with duty ethics are that it allows for no exceptions, and it may ultimately be premised on results. I think one of the reasons that Kant would say that you can never lie is that ultimately if everybody lied, you would have bad results, and that would be ethically problematic, and we could never form a society that was cohesive and cooperative. And so in the end, I think if you really press Kant, he would have to admit that results do somewhat matter. Unlike the 2 first valid ethical theories that I discussed, the third is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a holistic approach in that it doesn't attempt to tell us what to do in discrete situations, but rather it tells us how to behave holistically. It was developed by Aristotle in his 2 most famous books on ethics, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. And you also see echoes of it in his Aristotle's The Politics, Aristotle's Friendship. And it's based on this idea of a balance of the golden mean. And so what you see in Aristotle is that it's the extremes, it's the mean between 2 extremes that are virtues. So for example, what it would be a virtue in business? Well, it would be frugality, or the elimination of waste. What is the elimination of waste? Well, the extreme would be the excessive, just creating lots of waste in a product or a manufacturing process. But if you are too parsimonious in your product management, you may create a product that's not durable or long-lasting. And so the mean between those 2 extremes would be to create a product that is both environmentally sustainable and sound, eliminates as much waste as possible, but is also economically feasible. The problems with virtue ethics, since I give you the problems with the others, are that the ends, or how do we determine what is the end of a human being? For example, how do we determine what the virtues for human beings or even a company are? If we determine the virtues, are we going to be able to teach them? There is one notable exception, and I provide this as a source for you. It's 13 Virtues by Benjamin Franklin, and I would suggest that if you are going to base yours on virtue ethics, that you look at the website that I provided, and I've provided those also in the materials, www.13virtues.com. I know this has been an extremely short video on ethics, but I hope that it is beneficial. Again, if you want more in-depth coverage on ethics, I will provide links for those topics as well, and you're welcome to view those. Those are also available on YouTube. Thanks, and good luck in the Challenger Sales Ethics Case Competition.